Today, by request of the patrons, we're looking at probably the most divisive entry in the Diablo franchise, Diablo 3. Though oddly enough, that division has mended a little bit between the two communities with the release of Immortal as the community punching bag, because it made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. That said, while I personally have mixed feelings about Diablo 3, the reality is that I feel it falls into a very common trapping in sequels, especially sequels developed by different companies than their original creators. And that is, they made a good enough game for what it is, but they didn't make it a good game for the franchise. So what would have been an 8 out of 10 if released under a different name, becomes a 6 out of 10 because it does not fit right with the other games. You see this with other titles throughout history too though, with infamous examples being present in other large franchises like Castlevania and Zelda, though those did not have the excuse of it being by a different company. This is because with Diablo, there are a few other additional interesting tidbits. First off, Diablo 3 as we know it, now at least, is multiple steps away from its origins. Starting even in pre-release with the closure of Blizzard North, at least the studio, and dispersal of the original Diablo team by Vivendi, the original design for Diablo 3 never actually saw the light of day and sometimes gets referred to as Diablo 2.5 for that very reason. And with this closure, the Diablo franchise got moved over to the Irvine campus, known for Warcraft and Starcraft, and this new design philosophy shaped what we now know of as the actual Diablo 3. And even post-release, Diablo 3 has drastically changed, and admittedly improved since its release a decade ago. Now, I could delve more into the ancient history of this title and all the things that have changed since launch. But the reality is, unless you're playing this on console, you're not going to ever have the ability to encounter most of it, since Diablo 3 was one of those wonderful early adopters of making a game that could easily be played offline, require permanent online connectivity. And yes, I will harp on this until the day I die, and I will harp on it when Diablo 4 releases too, especially since, at least for Diablo 3, consoles can play offline, it's just PC that can't, which makes zero sense. That aside, as far as the story, it's fairly similar regardless of which character you decide to go through with it, and it's got some variance in the side quests and interactions you can get, but you'll fight the same bosses, travel across the same maps, and achieve the same end results, just with different cinematics. And I know some people will say the point of these games is not the story, but I come from an RPG background, and as such, story is important to me, even if it's not at the forefront, since it marks the beginning and the end of the core game experience, leaving everything outside of that scope for the crowd that appreciate the post-game content, which, like a responsible action RPG, Diablo 3 will deliver on, with different levels of post-game content available depending on what you're interested in, with everything from extremely basic item-focused post-game content, as well as more quest-oriented systems with bounties and such, and adventure mode. But probably the most infamous post-game content is the ever simply repetitive Rift system, which is generally the focus of most people in the endgame because it is the most efficient growth path, and Rift number is relatively easy for a measurement of EPing. As far as whether I enjoy it, it's okay, but games as a service or lifetime games generally don't appeal to me for very long since they often fall into the trappings of either constant power bloat like Diablo 3 or constant feature bloat like Path of Exile, and it weirdly hooks into the back of my brain in a manner that makes me scream about how blatantly it exploits the psychology of addiction. And this nature is why even a comparative flop like Immortal still rakes in tons of money. Sure, it's a fraction of what Genshin Impact did in the same amount of time, but both perform the same function. Diablo 3 at least restricts this aspect to eating your time instead of both your time and your money. Now, it may seem like I'm being harsh on Diablo 3, when in reality, I think it's a competent game, just wrapped in some things I dislike, so that layer tends to paint the rest of my view. But whenever you strip that wrapping away and look at the game itself, or more precisely the game the designers likely wanted to make, you have a fairly competent action RPG from a combat standpoint and a fun game to play, albeit on the more streamlined and arcadey side that can provide plenty of satisfaction if you know what you're getting into beforehand. This is because, in spite of the story getting a bit heavy on the MacGuffinitis and the restrictive always online and soul-bound item systems, the actual gameplay has been streamlined and focuses in on exploring that more than human power fantasy by making your Nephilim character able to blast through crowds with its flashy and explosive ability pool, and the majority of what you deal with will itch the part of your brain that feeds on these cathartic experiences with big numbers, big explosions, and swarms to dish out the dopamine. The items similarly follow a system that is generally just bigger numbers are better, Spells are malleable and adjustable on the fly without needing to worry about spending a ton of time grinding out other things to reset them like in Diablo 2, and you can fairly easily change and adapt the difficulty to fit your needs, wants, or whatever you desire. So for better or worse, it is much more accessible than any of its predecessors, while still thankfully being at least a little more in terms of depth than its youngest cousin Immortal, though we will have to wait to see how it compares to the 4th mainline entry next year. Now, would I recommend Diablo 3 for people new to the franchise? It kinda depends on what type of games you're coming from. If you've never played an action RPG before, or you prefer things more in the roguelite or action-centered style of play, rather than the loot and character building style, then actually I would recommend Diablo 3. But if you want something with more depth and atmosphere, you'll want to lean more into its predecessors, since Diablo 1 captures the dark gothic aesthetic the best, while Diablo 2 rewards you more for planning your character and putting thought into your skills, stats, and even equipment choices due to how it's designed. But both these games show their age with much slower gameplay and less forgiving systems. As far as how it compares to Immortal, the simple truth is that Immortal is just a super stripped down version of Diablo 3's already streamlined gameplay, with most of the endgame turned into a redundant and blatant cash grab and time sink, rather than Diablo 3's much more normal and approachable, here's more game with bigger numbers if you want to put in the time approach. So if you want simple, I would still definitely recommend Diablo 3 unless the only system you have to play on is a phone or tablet, since Diablo 3 on PC or console is orders of magnitude above Immortal. So in short, if you want simplified equipment, some customization in your appearance and mercenary supports, as well as some basic crafting and post-game content with a passable but not godly story, and even, well, fairly malleable skills, then Diablo 3 will easily work for you, and you won't regret playing through it if you want to know more about Sanctuary. Though whether it sticks will depend on what you want out of it, but it's not hard to get your money's worth out of 1 or 2 playthroughs, especially if you get it on sale, which Blizzard has been doing more of in the recent years. So while this is a slightly weighted question since you know what the rest of the content on the channel has been about, which of the 3 mainline Diablos have you preferred over the years? Do you think certain ones were better or worse on console than PC? Talk about it down below, and you may even get mentioned in another upcoming video in the near future on the subject of action RPGs. And if you want to see where Diablo started, check out the video on screen now, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye.